All right, so hi everyone, and welcome to the first talk of the Youth AI speaker series tonight. And we're so glad that you could all join us. So before we begin, I'd first like to talk about the Youth AI Lab and our mission. So I'm a high schooler that's passionate about ML and what it can do. But through my journey learning about ML, I've found that there's not many resources that are friendly to youth starting out in the field. And there's a lack of a cohesive, supportive community for youth. So that's why our mission here is to make AI more accessible to youth, especially high schoolers. To address these problems, we hope to provide the following resources. Firstly, by gathering experts from industry, academia, and government, our speaker series hopes to provide meaningful insight into the latest problems and active research fields in AI in a manner suitable to high schoolers. Secondly, through our online forums on our website at youthai.org, we hope to provide peer-to-peer mentoring and allow students to form meaningful connections with like-minded peers. And thirdly, we hope to organize online AI-centric hackathons aimed at allowing you to test your skills and solve real-world problems with real-world impact. And finally, thanks to our partnerships with research labs, we hope to match talented students and professors whose interests overlap by providing internship opportunities. And we'd just like to thank our currently affiliated labs for all of their support through this process and helping support youth education in AI. And we'll also send out our weekly newsletter with updates, interesting AI developments, and the link to the next speaker series talk if you register on our website at youthai.org. So just briefly, some QA logistics. The meeting is limited to 300 people, and due to overwhelming demand from you guys, which is wonderful, we aren't able to really do questions in a live format or through the Zoom chat. So what we're going to do is going to use a platform called Slido. So if you go to either the first link or you go to sly.do and enter the event code 39427, or scan the QR code. You'll find a platform where you can just ask all your questions there, and that way we can streamline the QA asking process. So I'll just leave that slide up for a bit so everyone can. And all right, I'm going to move on, but if anyone wants the link, I'll also put it in the chat as well. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. John Cohn. We're very grateful to have him today to give the first Youth AI Lab talk. Dr. Cohn is a legendary scientist at IBM. His accomplishments at IBM are super impressive across 4 major tech areas, from chip design to CAD to IoT and now to AI. More importantly, Dr. Cohn has dedicated a significant amount of his time promoting technology to tens of thousands of kids and adults, changing the lives of many people, myself included. The fact that Dr. Cohn is here today speaks to how much he cares about the youth community. Dr. Cohn just lost his beloved dog Satori yesterday. Satori was part of Dr. Cohn's family and was one of his best friends for the last 12 years. Satori will live on through a new AI-oriented computing cluster at MIT, also named Satori. Today, we'd also like to dedicate our first Youth AI Lab talk to Satori. Dr. Cohn, we're sorry for your loss and grateful for you to be here with us in this difficult time. I will pass the talk to you now.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. It's really amazing. And I'm so impressed that you've put this all together. You always impress me incredibly. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. And I really appreciate, from my family to yours, what you just said about Satori. We'll talk a little bit about Satori today. Let me get myself set up here. Let's see if I can remember how to work this crazy thing. Whoa, wait, did you just, let's see.
I believe someone else is screen sharing right now. So.
Yeah. Oh, am I supposed to? I'm supposed to though, right? Yeah?
Yeah, there you go.
All right, well, I will I'll take this off. This is just a little bit of fun. I really appreciate the warm welcome. Please put your questions in there. We'll try to get to them. I'll try to go. But what I'm going to tell you is a little bit of a kind of mixed story about, I'm going to eventually talk about AI, but I want to tell you a little bit about how I got there and how that actually took me kind of back to the future. And that's a real DeLorean. I got to drive around. I'll tell you about that in a second. But first, a little bit more about me. That was a wonderful introduction, Jeffrey. But and I got to tell you that it's pretty cool that you would pick me as your youth AI kickoff thing because I'm so youthful. But the truth is, everyone, I am an old guy, but I am a real first class nerd. I have been at IBM for 39 years as of a week ago, Monday. And I want to tell you a little bit more about it. But what I knew when I was 8 years old that I wanted to go to MIT and be an engineer. And I have a feeling that some of you on this phone call, probably most of you, are that same sort of kindred spirit, kindred nerdy kind of spirit. I am just so happy to be, a nerd for almost the last. Am I, Jeffrey? Am I full screen to now?
You still need the full screen. Yeah.
It's not full screen?
Yeah. So.
Oh, it's full screen to me. Let's unshare. And let's try sharing again. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
That's
Is
perfect.
that full screen?
Yeah, that's perfect.
It is. So I want to now good. Okay. I want to introduce a couple of other people just to give you context. So I told you I was with IBM and in this industry for 39 years. I want to introduce a couple more people just to help me tell the story. This is my late father-in-law, Gabriel Mariano. He worked at IBM for 36 years and he was a nerd of a very different generation. He was a mechanical nerd. He was hired right out of high school to go to IBM College where he learned to make things. He loved making big robotic machines that were used to assemble our computers at the time. They were made out of pieces, they were made out of steel and rock, concrete, and they were big, big robots. He's right here, this, yikes, younger, this short guy there. We agreed on all sorts of things and loved making things. But what he made that I think is really amazing was my wife, Diane, who was for 8 years, also an IBMer. She was a physics major, then did master's degree in electrical engineering. Between us, as of Monday, we have 84 years in this one technology. Hey, sounds like somebody's got to go on mute. Everybody go on mute? Okay, great. So what the reason I'm telling you that is that I've got 84 years of nerdiness, and that's given me a pretty good perspective on how things have changed because I haven't really had a front row seat for how technology has been driven. And it gave me kind of a perspective that I think these are kind of crazy times. I figured it was worth sharing. A little while ago, my company, and I'm not going to try to sell you on my company, but my company turned 100 years old, and that's a big deal. And because I was the oldest, or certainly the funniest looking person from my company in the state, I had to go talk to the senators and the governor. And I remember there was a big article in the newspaper, and it said underneath it, it said 100 years, meaning IBM had been 100 years old. And I walked in there, and he goes, "You don't even look like you're 80." And I thought, But what I was thinking about during that time is how much technology had changed. So I did a little bit of homework and I looked at for the span of 100 years, you've heard of things like Moore's Law since 1960s, that technology has doubled in speed. For a while, it was doubling in speed and quadrupling in capacity for almost 4 decades. But if you actually look over 100 years, that story is even more impressive because when you look back at the first computers, like our company's first computers, IBM's first computers were actually mechanical computers. They'd calculate like how much cheese, like if cheese was 3 cents a pound, they would calculate, they'd have a scale and it would physically calculate. Then we started making electromechanical computers. So basically these were machines that actually had motors and cams that were driving, like the Mach 1 computer that was built at Harvard during the Second World War that could multiply 50 pairs of 10-digit numbers in a second. That was unthinkable. Well, as you just keep moving up that and you ask yourself, how much compute could you buy for $1,000 in today's currency. So that's adjusting for all the changes in currency. So we went from mechanical to electromechanical to vacuum tubes, which is what I started on. I still do stuff with vacuum tubes, to discrete transistors, which is what was going on in the company when I joined and what my father-in-law used to work on, to integrated circuits. This is a log chart. This means that we've been scaling super linearly for over 100 years, just all that innovation. Well, that's pretty cool. But the reason I'm telling you that is because that looks kind of smooth. I mean, it certainly wouldn't look like things would change radically and you would fall off the cliff, but it's actually a more complicated story. These are all real computers, not necessarily by my company, but just through all these different computers, and how much compute power you could get for that same $1,000. But it's anything but smooth. It's these periods of smooth, and then these real disruptions, these crazy things when something that used to work stopped working. I remember, for example, I was working on these computers that used bipolar transistors. They just kept getting faster and faster. They were amazing. But the problem is they'd start catching fire or melting. And we were told that that was bad for sales. And we were like, So we actually had to change to a completely different technology path. So this is just about when I was joining the company, we had to jump to a new technology. It was called CMOS. And basically those gaps are really scary because you continuously innovating and then it stops working. Those disruptions define new companies. Companies that couldn't make that leap to the new technology no longer make computers. There's, companies like Nixdorf or Bull or Xerox stopped making computers around this time because they just couldn't make that leap. On the other hand, some people who made the leaps too fast guessed wrong. And, companies like Amdahl or whatever, they kind of fell off the edge. So it's kind of an interesting thing about how these disruptions, how companies face that. Well, the reason I'm saying that is because it's not just true of companies. If you look at where we are now, and I just want to say this because this is the weirdest time I've been in this industry, I've been on this earth for over 60 years, and I've never seen a time that is as complicated as this. Whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the political strife, whether it's race, all of these things really weigh on us. And the question is, these are these disruptive times. And our lives all are going to have those same kind of pieces of smooth sailing and then those disruption. And, instead of measuring how fast it is, it might be how much money you make or how much fun you have or how much responsibility you have, or, and we worry so much about those things, or one over the amount of hair you have or whatever. But, you'll have these periods of continuous stuff, and then you'll have these discontinuities. Sometimes they're fun, like, oh, well, where should I go to college? I wanted to go to MIT. I already knew that. Should I go buy a haunted schoolhouse in Vermont? I didn't have to worry about who to marry because I joined the right company and they issued me a wife. That whenever you go get a job, you should make sure that's part of your contract, wife or husband or whatever you want. But, how many kids do you want to have? Where should you go to grad school? Should you get a tattoo of your company in a place you can't show people? That's true, but it was a henna tattoo. But all of those decisions, and sometimes, and I'm not going to go into it now, but sometimes really hard things happen to your life. And, this kind of time is one of those things. Like, I just have to say that one of the hardest things that we've ever done is our middle son passed away about 14 years ago. And, it completely disrupted everything in my life. And I decided I wanted to devote my life to helping people like you get excited about technology. It even drove me to be on a reality show, but that's a completely different talk. My point is that these disruptions, whether it's where you go to college or what do you study or who do you marry or how do you get through a really difficult situation like this, it really depends on how you face those disruptions. And I have a secret that I thought about a long time, because actually it occurred to me a few years ago when my youngest son, who's now a PhD student in biochemistry, I got invited to give a talk for him at one of his schools presentations. And that was really scary because we live in a town of only 4,000 people. And if I sucked there, that's forever. So I tried to figure out, what would it be like to be in high school? What could I have told myself back, 45 years ago What would I wished I'd told them? What's the secret for getting through these complicated times? Well, I'll tell you the secret. The secret is play. And I mean it. You're all very serious students, and I know you love this stuff, but we worry so much about, oh, if I don't get an A on this test, if I don't get this AP score, I won't get into that college, and I won't marry that guy or that girl, and I'll never get this job, and I'll end up living in a ditch. And we spend so much time worrying about things like that that we get paralyzed. The point is, when I look back over my life and my career, the times that I've actually been most playful, I've been most successful. So your path is going to vary, but I hope that you would keep that in mind. I'm telling you the opposite that most of your teachers and parents are saying. I'm telling you, you got to learn to play. You got to keep that. You were born knowing how to play with stuff. You were born knowing how to misbehave and goof around and not worry. And we learn so much about getting so uptight. That is not the way to be resilient. That is not the way to be happy. So goof off more. If you want to tune out now, that's my main message. But I'm looking back because in my whole life of my technical career, play has been a real issue, a real thing, even in my technical life. Because when I look back about the times I've been most productive, most inventive, were also the times I was working the hardest, had a lot to do with play. I was lucky enough to work with a bunch of real smart people, including, by the way, Jeffrey's dad, David, for a brief period there. We worked on all sorts of things. We worked on these crazy computers. The most exciting of them were actually video games. So it's probably your parents' generation or your older brother and sister's generation where, game consoles were actually the first supercomputers you could really buy. So these were chips that I worked on. This was PlayStation 3. These are not to scale, by the way. That's a much bigger chip. This is Xbox 360. This is Nintendo Wii. And this is Power 7, which was inside the Watson computer. We can talk about that in a little bit. But I was working on those things, and then they were insanely hard, but it was great to come home and talk to my kids or their friends and tell them, Daddy may be tired, but he's making video games. I remember actually having a somewhat serious conversation about Xbox 360, where we were going to call the president of Microsoft at the time, Bill Gates, and ask him if he could move Christmas 2 weeks out because we were having a little bit of a schedule problem. We made the date. But when I look back, I can actually plot. I have about 120 patents, and they all peaked at those most fun, most adventurous times. But what's really interesting is I'm not just saying that it's fun to work on stuff like that. What's so interesting when I think about technology and the whole course of technology, including AI that we're going to talk about, it was really in large part driven by play. These video games were the fastest computers you could buy at the time. And they were driven because they wanted, you wanted to be able to frag your friends or whatever. The thing that's driven technology, that's driven bandwidth, that's driven memory, often is entertainment. It's because people want to watch movies, play games, make fun stuff. So play feeds technology and technology feeds play. So this thing has been a pattern that has actually worked many times in my life. So I did my first 30 years working on chips. And it's really funny, by the way, just keep in mind that these technologies, like these little 8 bars right down here in the PlayStation 3, those were some of the first GPUs. We'll come back to GPUs. I mean, GPUs is what makes AI work. Well, it turns out that making things, I've always liked making things, but it's not just at work. Especially after, the tragedy of when our son passed away, I realized that I wanted to be an evangelist. I wanted to help people see the beauty in technology and science that I did. And so I started working with people. I started working with students, even when I was a youth. And so I helped create, I can't see myself. Let's see if I can see, let's see. Yeah. Is that backwards? That's backwards. Is that forwards? Yeah. I created an organization. I created the Vermont's own MIT club, Vomit, Vermont own MIT club. And we were in business to help try to get kids interested in tech so that maybe one day they would go to MIT. I'm a big MIT fan. So I started building stuff with people. So this, for example, we had a group that came to us and they said, dear vomit, can you make a device for scaring children? And we said, okay, how big does it have to be? They said they wanted it to be 7 meters tall. They wanted it to pop out of the trees and scare the you know what out of kids. And I thought, that is a really good use of an MIT education. So we started building this thing, and it was remotely controlled. And as you talked, its meter wide mouth would go blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And working with kids, that started to get me pretty energized. But as you'll see, it actually made a big difference in my work. I started making things with other people. Like this thing is also 7 meters tall. It's a big carousel thing for carrying hippies across the desert at a festival in Nevada that I go to called Burning Man. Again, that's my brother driving it. And actually, Ben and Jerry were there too. I made that for Ben of Ben and Jerry's. But basically, it had remote control devices, and I was able to control the lights remotely. Now, why am I telling you that? Well, one, because they're cool, but I've got a whole big portfolio of those. But it turned out that after 30 years of working on chips, I said, I want to do something different. Well, it turned out that my company wanted to get into something called Internet of Things. I don't know if you know what Internet of Things is. You probably do. You probably know more about it than I do. But at Internet of Things is basically taking chips and controlling them at a distance from software, hooking them up. Well, it was a pretty interesting thing because our company wanted to get in to making Internet of Things. And they asked me, at that time I was very senior. I'm an IBM Fellow, and I couldn't just, apply for the job. They said, well, what do you know about it? Well, I showed them gigantic 7 meter tall craziness. And they said, okay, you're hired and you can go run this place. So I ended up, these two buildings were in Munich, Germany. And I got to go there every other week. So every other week I jumped on an airplane, went over to Munich, and my job was to play with this building. It was to hook it up, to make it an Internet of Things wonderland, to be able to hook up all sorts of sensors so that we could tell, was the cafeteria empty? Where was there a desk open? Did somebody forget to wash their hands in the bathroom? It was the most fun thing. But the way I got that job is because I had made those crazy things. So I guess my message there is the stuff you play with. So if you're making AI now as a high school student, the stuff that you might make in your spare time might end up being the most important thing that gets you into college, that makes you have a job. And if you keep that, because it's so easy to lose that as you get older, you get so many things on your plate, just keep playing. And it turns out that that's where this story actually changes a little bit, because I was playing, I was up there and I was supposed to be doing one thing. See, playing involves doing a little bit of misbehavior. If you just do what you're told to do, you'll never get ahead. You have to do some stuff you're not being asked to do, you're not supposed to be doing. And while I was supposed to be selling IoT, I was starting to fall in love with artificial intelligence. I didn't even know how to spell AI, but I started trying to figure out, the first experiment, I was trying to figure out, how do you figure out how many people are in a room without using a camera? And it turns out we wrote some AI models, and it turns out that the air you breathe, the time rate of change of the CO2 that you have is a really good indicator of how many people are in the room. Well, while I was doing the AI thing, I was still flying back and forth collecting frequent flyer miles, and I just said, I don't need that anymore. Well, what happened is that our company created a laboratory at MIT, go MIT. I love MIT. And I realized that it could actually be a perfect job, because instead of being 5,000 miles away, it's only 250 miles away from where I live up in Vermont. So this lab that we created there, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, then I'll tell you some of the projects that we did. The whole idea is to build a project around next generation of AI. We've got projects there on AI algorithms, which are like learning to be, closer to general intelligence. How to make AI, the physics of AI, so that we don't destroy the planet by using up all the power. How do we apply AI in industries in an appropriate way? How can you use AI for security? How do you use AI for healthcare? How do you use AI to help people make money or protect money or not steal money? And how do you make AI ethical so that it actually does the right thing, so that it benefits more people than it hurts? And this has been a great experience. And I want to tell you a little bit more about it. But the really cool thing is, I mentioned that I really like MIT, but my company, IBM and MIT, have been at this for a long time. And what's interesting is that, I don't know if everyone knows this, but MIT is really the ground zero for AI. The first time anybody said the phrase artificial intelligence was supposedly at this party. It was a seminar called the Symposium on Artificial Intelligence. It was organized by MIT, but it was actually at Dartmouth College, which is in New Hampshire, just down the road. And it was a mix of people from all different kinds of industries. Right there in the center is the guy who's often considered to be the father of AI, Marvin Minsky, who was also the father of my MIT roommate, Henry Minsky, who's still my very good friend. And then there are other people like Claude Shannon, the father of information science. There are some IBMers in there. Can you figure out who they are? They're the ones with ties, because I remember when I hired in, I had to wear a tie every day to work, which is weird. So we have this long history going back there from 1956. But actually, if you want to know about, oops, what happened? Hey, Jeffrey?
Yeah?
Can you still see my screen?
No. Did you stop sharing?
I didn't.
Oh.
I have a redirect notice. Please hold. Your call is very important to us. Here. Now, can you see?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Oh, cool. Oh, that was weird. But no, every time I click, oh, I get it. I know what's going on. Excuse me. Please hold. It thinks I'm trying to, you can see that?
Yeah.
For some reason, it thinks I'm trying to click. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me keep going. And if something screws up, we'll just make it up. So this lab that we've done, I just want to tell you quickly about the lab. Then I want to go back and talk a little bit more about AI and the kind of stuff that we're doing. Our lab is actually a 10-year experiment where we're spending $250 million. We have about a $240 million commitment over 10 years, which includes people, computers, and research funding. We have about all of the projects that we do there. We have probably right now about 60 projects. They're all done in collaboration. So every line of code, every paper, every patent, we do jointly with the MIT folks. There are 23, now I believe 24 departments in MIT, and we do work with every single one of them. And that involves about, even though our team itself is just under 30 people, when you look at actually the whole group of people who are in IBM who are working with us and the IBMers, they're about 150 people. And twice a year we go and we get proposals, and we get about 250 of those each call. And it's a very, very selective process. And it's been a great experience. But what I want to talk to you about now is some of the stuff that we're exploring there. So I'm going to keep moving. So to talk about AI, I think what I want to tell you is sort of the journey that we're on. So if you actually, I showed you that picture of, the start of AI being 1956, the AI symposium. Actually, if you really want to think about what is driving, why is AI so big right now, you have to actually look way back to about 1900. This is a guy named Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He was an artist and an anatomist. And he was the first person who actually looked inside an animal's brain and actually got the structure of how the brain of an animal brain works, of all these simple neurons. And you know about neural nets, but it was an aha moment. And this idea that if nature used these lots of simple computers, lots of simple like 1-bit computers that fanned out, that had many little things feeding into them and one output that could fan out, that idea that we could do compute was available over 100 years ago, 120 years ago, but it just never really worked. As a matter of fact, Marvin Minsky, who I knew quite well, was working on electromechanical versions of these neural computers back in the 1970s when I knew him, and they just couldn't figure out how to make it work. And the basic concept was pretty easy because this is the way animals do it. You basically take a bunch of input, like it could be pictures or whatever, and you would make these networks. And then by adjusting the weights on the networks, you would basically forward propagate. You would do a bunch of just simple linear algebra. You would then compare, did I get the thing right? And then you would increase the weights on the things that matched the right, that it came out the right answer, dog, cat, maybe badger, whatever. And then you would decrement the weights. I mean, this is way simplistic, but then you would decrement the weights. And if you had millions and millions of pictures with millions and millions of labels that said what everything was, you can train these models. Now, what happened is that it for many years, this idea was around. Like I said, Minsky and his folks were actually talking about these perceptron networks back in the 70s, but nobody could ever make anything that was very useful. And it wasn't until about 2012, I think with AlexNet, where somebody had the bright idea that if we could just make all those linear algebra calculations faster, that we could probably make a meaningful sized neural net. And people were using regular computation. But what happened is that somebody had the great idea to start using graphics processors from, guess what? Video games. And from 2012 until now, it has just exploded. It is growing like crazy because all of a sudden we had enough compute that we could actually make these neural nets work. We had enough bandwidth. Then we made enough money to build more bandwidth, more compute, and it has taken off. And then we finally got the open source software that actually made it. And the projections for AI is growing like crazy. Forbes said it, that deep learning and machine intelligence will eat the world. I mean, it's growing up to the point where it's trillions of dollars in projected growth. So this is why you are getting into this industry as AI youth. You could not be joining at a better time. When I look back over my 40 years of doing chips, it was a fantastic time to be doing chips. But you know what? That's where the action is right now, is in AI. And that's why it's so cool that you're here. Now, when you think about what AI can do now, it's pretty good at a lot of stuff. As I mentioned, I've been working on games. Well, AI, of course, is the first thing that anybody did with it was play games. There were people playing some of the first AI, really good AI results were on video games and Atari games, the simpler ones first, and then more complicated ones. Our company did some really cool stuff with taking on things like taking on humans in the game Jeopardy, which is just complete random knowledge set in a kind of a weird construct where you have to ask it as questions, but it's all general knowledge. I worked on that project and it was so amazing to take a chip, well, it turned out quite a few of those chips, of these Power 7 chips, and actually beat the world's expert in this kind of knowledge. It was super exciting. There were hundreds of people working on it and we were all holding our breath waiting for it. The same thing, we had people earlier on, we were using a kind of limited type of AI to play chess, but like Google did, did Go, and that's a much more computationally intensive thing. But it's now being applied to all sorts of things like poker, bridge, backgammon. It's kind of, again, this theme that AI, that tech and play are completely mixed up all the time, and that actually looking at things that are challenges to our own brains are a great challenge to artificial brains. We've even figured out how to automate arguing. Just imagine that. David, does the sound come across when I do that?
Yes.
Okay.
Just imagine this, a robot debating a human.
We think that it's not that the government money won't help out if it were to be given. We just think it doesn't meet the criteria in comparison to other things.
If I may put it a bit differently, subsidizing space exploration is like investing in really good tires. It may not be fun to spend the extra money, but ultimately, both you and everyone else on the road will be better off.
So actually, it's very interesting that our team that's in Haifa, which are champion arguers, people I've worked with for decades, have actually worked very well they've actually made a machine that can argue. And in some countries, that's a game as well. It's a national sport. But all of that has been a great way of driving AI. And AI now, the kind of stuff that we have is really good at things. I mean, it can take the standard AI models that you can just download from Google or Facebook, will help you. You can take a picture and you can ask it to annotate it, like man in black shirt is playing guitar. Yeah, construction worker in orange safety vest working on the road. We take it for granted that this kind of stuff can happen. We take it for granted that it can recognize faces, that even our phones, even running, some of the work that Jeffrey and David's lab, next week's speaker, Professor Song Han, is a champion in being able to make AI models that actually run on simple phones, that they can recognize people. But there's a catch. AI is doing great things, but there is something, what all these people have in common? They don't exist. These are synthesized faces. So while AI is doing all these wonderful things, there is so much left to do and so many things that we have to take care of. These are all synthesized by a technique called GANs, generalized adversarial networks. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Go look at that though. Every time you hit that link, thispersondoesnotexist.com, you get a new artificial face. And I tell you what, it is amazing because these look like real people, but they're not. So we've got to figure out how we're going to make AI work for us as it gets better. We're just at the beginning of this. The way we like to think about AI is we start from where we are right now is just getting past narrow AI. Narrow AI is the kind of AI that allows you to recognize your face, or that, when you post your pictures, it figures out who you and your homies, who's in the picture. AI, it's doing some really remarkable things, like being able to look at, skin lesions and decide which ones need to be biopsied for cancer. It's actually, on many tasks, as good at or better and much faster than a human. So that's sort of where we are with narrow AI. We're just getting into what we like to call broad AI, which is multitask, multi-domain, multimodal, and distributed, and it can work well with humans. There are systems now that are starting to become more popular. Like if you've ever been in a Tesla with self-driving cars, any sort of self-driving car, that is a broad AI application. But, we're still getting, some systems like air travel are getting highly automated. Cars are getting better, but for the most part, we're working on projects, for example, to put AI in a surgical ward so that we can actually, help doctors and nurses make better decisions. It's a really complicated thing. You need to be able to work with a human, learn from a human, and explain your actions. We're just at the beginning of that. And eventually we want to get to general AI, which is cross-domain, totally autonomous, and it's what Hollywood talks about. And whether we get, if we want AI, the good AI, or we want AI like Skynet, the one that's going to take over the world, we have to start thinking about that now. I mean, the point at which a general AI becomes human-like could actually, function in our world. There are people who are saying that that's probably not till, some optimists say it'll be in the late 2030s. Most people say it's like in the 2050s. And when somebody says it's that far out, it means they don't know. But that doesn't mean that we don't start thinking about it now. And that is a part of what we're doing as our lab is focused on moving towards, through broad AI. And that means making AI explain itself better, because many techniques like our neural nets are great, but by themselves, if they misrecognize something, there's no line of code that says, if not raccoon. How do you explain the choices that you made and learn? We have to make sure that AI is both secure from the standpoint is that you can't cause it to do the wrong thing. You can't have it divulge information, and that AI is not used to force its way into other computing systems. So we have to worry about that. We have to worry about ethics, to make sure that AI is making decisions like we would like them to, that it reflects our ethics. And that's a pretty hard thing because, as you know, in these times that not everybody agrees on the same ethics. But how do we make computation that actually, helps promote human good and doesn't, do harm to people? And that isn't as far-fetched as you think. We also have to figure out how we make AI more scalable, and even spelling it right. But the problem right now is that using all of that labeled data that it takes to train one of these AI takes an incredible amount of power. And I think Professor Hahn next week will tell you about that. But there's some projections that if we don't change what we're doing with supervised learning, that AI is going to start using a good portion of the world's energy by the end of the 2030s. Now, I don't think that's going to happen because we're going to get better computers, but we're also going to have to learn how to learn on smaller amounts of data. You know, when you look at looking at an animal and trying to figure out how does a creature learn, or a baby, you look at a baby doesn't need to look at a million labeled examples of cats and a million labeled example of dogs to be able to tell them apart. A baby actually brings in knowledge, transfers knowledge from other places, and then reasons and links and gathers information together and builds these symbolic links. So these are all the parts that we have to do to start building broad AI, and that's what our lab is doing. Because, you know, as good as AI is at sort of recognizing who's in your pictures, if you take these annotation and you give it something that it hasn't ever seen. These are some real annotations, which I think are pretty funny. Like this one was described as a man riding a motorcycle on a beach. Well, kinda. Or an airplane is parked on the tarmac at an airport. Something else going on there. I don't think it's parked. Or a group of people standing on top of a beach. Basically, current generation of AI can only tell you what it's seen before. Well, that's not very really useful in the world. I can tell you in industry, most of things are interesting that you've never experienced before. So we really got to think about how do we actually combine those. And so one of our main focuses at our lab is in combining aspects of neural networks with aspects of symbolic reasoning. So the ability to do something, you know, it's really easy. If I asked you, are there an equal number of large things and metal spheres in that picture? It takes you about 2 or 3 seconds. Well, you guys are smart, probably takes you 1 second. But if you try to train a single neural net to answer a question like that it's never actually been asked, it's not that easy, because I can take a neural net and I can de-render that whole picture and list out what's there, you know, that, oh, there's sphere, 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 square, square, square. But then if I want to answer a question like, are there an equal number of large things in metal spheres? You have to actually combine 2 different kinds of things. You have to sort of think fast, which is tell me what's on that picture. And then you have to kind of think slowly. You have to actually do some symbolic reasoning. And if you think about it, that's what goes on in your brain. And one of the projects that's being done by our friends, Jiajun Wu, Chong Gang, who's one of our lead researchers at our lab, and Josh Tenenbaum, who's an amazing MIT professor, that whole idea of how do we actually combine both neural processing and symbolic processing is broad AI. It's really using multimodal kind of stuff. So for example, here's another piece that Chong is also working on, but the idea of, let's say you had a real world situation. This is kind of a cool thing. Wait, so, sorry. The idea that they wanted to do is do something that we can do naturally, very easily. Excuse me. We do very naturally, which is basically tell me what each instrument sounds like. So notice the skeleton on this guy. So it's using his motion to determine that he's the one playing that note, and her skeleton to know. And by combining those things, we can actually use data. Oh, sorry. Wow. Oh. You can see her moving. Now watch her pick out her feet. So what it's doing is it's using information from multiple different sources. It's using neural nets to figure out what is actually going on in the screen. Then it's using another set of neural programs to map the pose of somebody, and then it's combining those things in a symbolic way to be able to isolate where in that sound stream, which sounds correlate to which actions. That's really something that humans do very well, but you can only do by combining multiple sources of AI. And this is just happening now. And by doing that, by applying that, I can dramatically reduce the amount of information that is needed to train these multiple models. I can basically reuse information that I know about poses oh, I see what's going on. I've got some timing going on. These things are advancing by themselves. But one of the things that's very interesting too is we've got to figure out how to make AI more explainable. And by more explainable, that means that we need to be able to figure out why an AI did something. So not only do we have to actually apply information from multiple sources and multiple modalities, like neural and symbolic, but we need to be able to explain individual decisions. Now, you probably have heard of GANs. These are generalized adversarial networks. And basically what you can do, those are the same things that were used to synthesize those fake faces. Okay, that's pretty cool. But what we're doing, what people have learned to do is use GANs to synthesize almost anything. It's a very, there's great examples out on the web for what's called style transfer. I can train a GAN on a particular artistic style, like a Munch on the lower left, or a Van Gogh on the upper left, or who knows what that is, maybe a Braque on the upper right. And then I can apply it to any sort of drawing. So I can take a scene and I can change its entire, how it renders to the world by applying a GAN. So that's a really fun thing. And that's the same kind of thing that is used for style transfer of all sorts of types. But what's really cool is that you can use that GAN and you can actually basically get it to choke down so that it can actually, instead of the neurons being all nameless function, you can actually get you can train the GAN network to be able to label specific things that mean something to humans. So for example, you can use it to train on a whole bunch of pictures of say a house, or living rooms or kitchens. And by focusing this down, by using special techniques to neck this down, I can actually force it to localize which node in that neural network has to do with windows, which has to do with chairs, which has to do with people. Now, that's really nice because I can use it to synthesize, but I can actually, there's some really cool work that our group is working on. There's a particular thing, if you go look up GAN paint, my friend Hendrik is working with MIT folks, Antonio Torralba and David Bao, that you can actually take your own pictures, or you can take pictures that are in there and you can use them. They're trained on a GAN, and then you can do something like, okay, here's a real picture on the left. I can do something like, okay, give it to me with no windows. And you'll see it'll just drop them out and replace it with something. And that synthesized picture, I was actually able to control by actually using human language. I was able to say, take out the windows. I don't mean verbally say, but I was actually able to take the fact that the GAN was annotated with things like windows, and by controlling that, I was able to remove the feature. Pretty important kind of thing, because any AI that actually has that can explain, can be taught, can be manipulated in a much better way. Again, moving into broad AI, where you're having to work well with people. So I mentioned that, having things explainable is really important. I talked about being able to learn on less data, but we also talked about security. And it turns out that AI is only as good as the data that you put in. And we've got people working on AI and security in a bunch of different ways. Just at the minimal level, about malware. Well, so do the malware writers are using AI. So AI is turning out to be the only really good defense against malware people who are writing AI. So we have some big projects in that. But one of the really fun projects we have around security is more about data results security. And it turns out that by just doing very small manipulations to the training set for some of these things, you can actually get an AI to misrepresent something in a dangerous way. So you notice that these stop signs here, they're just by putting a specific set of mislabeled data, just putting it into the millions, literally millions of pictures that we use to train things like that, I can get a standard AI model, which would normally recognize that as a stop sign, to say, oh, it's a brown teddy bear lying on top of a bed. It's just by putting bad data in a huge pile of data, which would never likely be found. That's a dangerous kind of thing, because you can imagine that if you could insert bad data in some of these standardized sets that nobody ever looks at, you could be in real trouble. But on a more fun side, a team of our researchers has actually tried to make, first we made glasses so that we could actually, certain patterns, we could infiltrate some of these training things to get people wearing these glasses to look like famous, to be recognized as famous people. But just recently, we actually made a t-shirt that confuses facial recognition. So you can actually have fun while trying to make AI much more safer by doing basically adversarial misclassification on purpose. But sometimes, we mentioned about AI having to be ethical. This is something that is really, while your mind goes to something like Skynet, I don't want AI to take over the world, it's actually something that is happening much closer to home. And you've probably seen how all of the discussion around facial recognition. But our company and MIT are doing a lot of work at trying to make AI much more fair. It turns out that the facial recognition stuff that we use, that we rely on all the time, for like Facebook or Instagram recognizing pictures, is really biased. And it's not biased because anybody intentionally, if you're a white male, you're probably in the high 90% of likely to be recognized. If you're a woman of color, it could be as low as in the 80%. And it's not because anybody intentionally meant to do that. It's because nobody paid enough attention that until actually there was a professor at the Media Lab, Joy Buluni, who's on the cover of Fast Company right now, started doing these analysis and recognizing that we really needed to be much careful about being fair. Now, and it turned out that we got clued into this, and we created some fairness tools to try to make sure that overall that we were feeding these AIs a balanced set, rather than just going out on the interwebs and looking at what was there, because the data that humanity gathers is unfortunately biased. Now, this is it's a fairness issue because you want everybody to be recognized. But imagine for a moment that this data is being used to decide whether someone should be arrested or worse, right? Well, that's why many places, many countries are starting to ban this kind of facial recognition, and why many companies like ours are saying we're not going to do this because we don't want our technology to be misused. So these kind of fairness concerns, are already with us, and it's something that you as young technologists really have to help your friends understand, that how technology, even good technology, can be misused or can be biased without anybody's intent. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about, I mentioned Satori, but the other challenge we had is that if we don't get better about using AI, changing the way we do AI, we're going to burn up all the energy in the world, and we're going to just spew it with carbon. Well, about a year ago, I started working on a project called Satori after our young dog, the one who just passed away. And we donated this computer, and it's a fairly large, it's a mid-range supercomputer with about 1.5 petaflops, and that it does it at about, that's at about 15.6 gigaflops per watt, which put it as the #4 greenest supercomputer in the world. And not only that, this computer, which many people use, and one of the things that Jeffrey and Alex who organized this call, part of the resources, I think, Jeffrey, this is okay for me to say, is you're going to be able to help make resources like Satori available to high school kids who have a really good project. So we're really excited about getting, advanced high school projects on there. And so, I believe, Jeffrey, you're going to be helping curate those, but we're really excited about that. Just one quick thing. I mentioned Satori is a word that means sudden enlightenment, but this is Satori, who passed away yesterday, and I'm still pretty sad about it, of course. She's a good girl. Not the smartest one, but the cutest, for sure. But the reason that I'm telling you that is that the Satori computer, as I mentioned, was the #4 I think it's now been bumped down. It's been a year. It's been bumped down to about number 5, but it's an energy efficient machine, but more importantly, it's housed at an energy efficient place. It's at the Mass Green High Performance Cloud Center, which is in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is pretty far from MIT, but it's connected by these really fat optical cables. And they buy 97%. Whoops, what happened? It's 97% green energy. And just to give that perspective, that if you were to take a workload like that you use for benchmarking, like a big linear algebra set, if you did that work on Satori, which is the number 4 energy efficient computer in the world, supercomputer, and you did it in an energy efficient facility like Mass Green Performance Center, you ran that workload, a realistic workload, it would emit about the carbon of 4.73. Looks like somebody's messing with my display. About 4.75, I'm in Vermont, so 4.75 maple trees. If you did that same piece of work using a computer of the same power of Satori, the same computational power, and in a data center which just had a normal United States power mix, it would be 280 maple trees. That's 70 times worse. So that we're working very hard to make computation, to give people feedback of how much carbon is used by doing your machine learning. So if you're doing a large supervised learning run, you've got to decide how many hyperparameters to use. You'll at least know, through the course of your experiment, you'll start to understand what the trade-offs are. And better yet, we think it's going to make better software algorithms. And again, I think next week you'll hear from Professor Hahn how his lab is actually radically reducing the amount of carbon necessary to train some big models, for example, for speech understanding. So finally, I have to end on play. AI is really serious business. You're coming into it at just the right time. It's an amazing time to be entering this field because we're going to have decades and decades and decades of fun as we move through broad AI and eventually get to general. But again, we've got to make sure that it's fun, and we got to make sure that the next generation, the kids who are little now, you have to teach them that they've got to they've got to be curious about technology. You have to know what it can and can't do. So I'm always trying to make something. So I wanted to share a tool that I made with you, and the source code is in there. And we have a tutorial. If you reach out to me, we can turn you on to a tutorial so you can write this yourself. But try running this on your phone or your laptop or your tablet. Make sure the sound is up first. It's called Variman. It's a visual theremin. Now, so it's ibm.biz/Variman. And if you run it on a Mac in Chrome, you can actually use it as a MIDI controller. And I use it to control my Tesla coil. The source code is at the bottom. And I just, I would be really interested in feedback on what could we actually make that work. If you just take a picture of that, you'll get a link to it. So that's pretty much all I got to say, is that, play is a really good antidote to stress. It is also a really good source for creativity. And it's a really, really good way to get people interested in the stuff you're interested in. And getting people interested in AI right now is about the most important thing I can think of. I've been in this industry for 40 years, and I've never seen technology change as fast as it is now. So again, you're entering it at a great time. Just good luck with all the crazy things that are going on in the world now. Go out, learn some cool stuff, make some cool stuff. And I'm really honored to helped kick off this series.
All right. Yeah, everyone thank you, Dr. Cohn, for such a wonderful talk. Really inspiring, and it's really shown us all a lot about AI and the future, and as well as your personal journey through tech as well. So again, just to repeat, we're doing all Q&A through Slido, since we have so many people, both in the Zoom and also on our live stream on our YouTube channel. So what we're going to do is I'm just gonna go down the list of questions. Please enter any questions there, as if you'd like, try raising your hand or in any of that. There's simply too many people in the room for us to really manage. So I guess starting with the first question, someone asked that AI is currently very nascent. Where do you see AI going in the next 10, 20, 50 years?
Well, I think that the main advances, as I was saying, is I think that we've got to figure out more nuanced ways of combining different types of AI so that you don't have to train everything on, tons and tons of labeled data. The world doesn't come like that. The world is actually a much more complicated place. You're often faced with new, situations that you've never seen before. So I think that these semi-supervised or unsupervised learning, which allows you to transfer knowledge in, I think that's going to be the next big thing. And I think it'll do a lot. It'll allow us to start to codify and collate information from different industries, and you'll be able to share that sort of meta information more easily. I think it will also help, kind of get around some of these, scalability and computational scalability that are causing such, which potentially could cause, major, if not cost problems, but environmental problems. So I think those are the major things that I think are happening next. The kind of, actually moving AI from just working on sort of abstract. I'm a practical guy and I work in industry. I think moving AI beyond just the laboratory and the college to get into sort of practical, complex, real world complexity is, I think, what the next kind of big things are going to be. And there's so many, the advances are coming so fast. I don't know if you guys have looked at things like GPT-3. Go look that up. That our ability to do sort of, predictive text stuff. You're finding that things will move around for a while, then all of a sudden there'll be a huge advance. And the wonderful thing that's driving this is open source. The fact that all of these models and techniques are being put out. There's such technical generosity in the world that I think that's fueling the sort of increase in a way that I've never seen on any other industry.
I think the next most popular question is, how did you train Watson to play Jeopardy?
It was so interesting to see it. So Sony Television, which had all the rights, gave IBM all of the games from 1984 until that time, which was 2011. And so you had not only the questions, but you had the answers that were given, right and wrong, and the timing. And so it was basically, and you have to remember, this was 2011. This was started 2.5 years before that. So AI, we didn't have GPUs or anything like that to accelerate computing, but it was trained on all of that data. And what was really interesting is, because my involvement was on the hardware side, and while I wasn't in on the training itself, I know that I think it was only 2 weeks before it was the actual game was on Valentine's Day. And only 2 weeks before, they added a whole lot more compute to it, because the problem is it was getting the right answers, but it was getting them slowly. So it was really interesting just to see how it all came together. It was maybe 1,000 people, and it was just the best moment. And of course we didn't know who had won until several weeks later, because it was recorded. It was a remarkable time. And the technology that we learned in terms of like knowledge representation, and how we actually did, we codified knowledge, and because it had all of these different engines. It had a rhyming engine, it had a riddle engine, it had a geography engine. How do you codify all that data so you could search it? Because there was no, it wasn't going out and asking, the internet. So some of the advances that came from that are really helped us in our AI journey. But it was super cool. One other thing about that was interesting. There was a guy named Ken Jennings, who was the world's, I think he's still the world's Jeopardy champion. What was really interesting is, because I got to look at the data, and you saw all of these, champions since 1984, and his data was so different than anyone else, including all the champions, that I am convinced he's from another planet.
All right, moving on to the next question. So Connor's asking that what's the best way to start learning in the field of AI?
The best way to start working in AI is the answer I would give to anything. It's to start playing. Go write something. One of the first AI programs I wrote was that Veriman thing. You got to start hands-on. The biggest problem I see is as people get more advanced in their careers, if you're not careful, you start making more PowerPoint than code. So the best way to learn, I mean, there's this wonderful, again, technical generosity. You can look at things like Khan Academy or Coursera, go take Andrew Ng's classes like I did. That's how I learned the math of it. But then don't just sit and study. Start writing code, write bad code, and then correct it and write slightly better code. So just start playing with it. I mean, as a matter of fact, the best way to learn AI is to do it when you're not supposed to be doing it. When you get so excited about writing AI that you stay up all night because you want to do style transfer to your badge picture like I did, then you know you're doing it right.
Yeah, so due to time concerns, and as we've already run a bit over, I'll just have one more question, and I'll be sure to send all of the questions to you, John, if you want to answer them.
Sure.
And
yeah,
we'll send that out in our Youth AI newsletter, and then
somebody
also
asked if I made the mask. Yes, I made the mask, and I just wrote an open source thing on Hack Day. If you want to, you can go look on Hack Day for it, and the code and everything is out there. Yeah. Okay, that sounds great.
and
That
yeah,
probably wasn't the question.
We're posting the entire recorded talk on our YouTube channel, so you can always come back.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
So I think the final question is, why do humans tend to anthropomorphize and antagonize this AI, such as in Terminator? And is this a limiting factor to the AI field?
I'm not programmed to respond to that, Jeffrey. I don't know, because I think we are afraid of things that are too different from us. So we tend to, anthropomorphize everything. Yeah, it's interesting to think about, because when you start thinking about general AI, we always think it will be like us. Gosh, it won't be. It'll be as alien as us and an octopus. I don't know why. I think because we're genetically selfish. We like everything to be like us. But I think it's going to be an interesting journey. And you guys are you all are in an age where you will see major advances towards that. And general AI won't just show up all at once. I mean, there could very well be the singularity, but the advanced AI will happen in domains, medical domain or something like that. It'll happen in, it's just like the future is here already, but it's not evenly distributed. We'll have things that approximate that kind of general AI in certain domains long before we have, a human companion that's like a general AI. It's going to be a very exciting journey. But I want you all to think about it and think about, that's why the ethics part is so interesting to think about. How do we make sure that any AI we create, that we don't relegate, decisions we wouldn't want a machine to make too early to something. You have to really think about, how can the technology that I'm creating be misused, or how can it go wrong? So I think a little bit of insecurity is a good thing. Think about how your stuff might, don't be so sure of yourself. Think about how it might be misused. And I think that's probably the best way to keep computers ethical.
All right. Yeah. Everyone, just please thank Dr. Cohn for spending his time talking about his personal journey in tech and also about AI.
And thank you, and best of luck with your with this series. I'm gonna keep tuning in. It's gonna be really fun.
And speaking of which, next week's talk we have, as Dr. Cohn mentioned, Dr. Song Han, an assistant professor at MIT. He's a pioneer in the field of efficient ML, which is about how do you deploy these large AI models that are meant to run on these massive servers, and how to pioneer in the field of on small devices. And he is also the co-founder of DeFi Tech, which is an AI chip company that was acquired a few years back by Xilinx. And he's named one of the innovators under 35 by MIT Tech Review. So you can register on our website, and then as a user on our website, you will automatically receive the link to his talk next week. So if you're interested in learning about how we can make AI more efficient and also more energy, especially in terms of energy efficiency, as Dr. Cohn mentioned, please check out Dr. Cohn's talk next week.
Yeah,
All
it'll
right.
be great. He's an amazing guy.
So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We hope you appreciated the talk, and we just hope that through our initiatives, we can continue to reach out to and spread AI awareness and to more people. So yeah, by coming here, we hope you learned a lot, and we hope that you continue to engage with our programs in the future.
All right, bye-bye.